Okay, hi, it's Jason, Conservative Policy News blog. I'm going to try this again. I'm trying to do this without reading it because I don't know, reading is kind of impersonal, and so I'm going to try to do this out of off the cuff. And I've been trying and editing, and obviously I'm not getting anywhere with it. Anyways, so yesterday, well, it's past midnight now, but basically yesterday, um, the Congress passed the health care reform bill. Now, it's interesting to me. Well, what I wanted to say about that, it was very interesting to me to watch Pelosi and other congressional leaders um, walk through the crowd hand in hand with the gavel for when they passed Medicare in 1965. They were obviously they were obviously hearkening back to the civil rights era and to that whole era of progressive legislation and progressive ideas. And in a sense, they kind of used that civil rights model, that NAACP, Thurgood Marshall kind of model of transformation, which is obviously their model for um, what they want to do today. And now I think the next thing they're going to try is immigration reform. And I think they're gearing up to use that model. Probably it will be a lot more obvious. Um, there's going to be a lot of personal sob stories. There will be a lot of accusations against conservatives when they try to pass amnesty. There'll be a lot of accusations harkening back to the bad old days or the good old days of the progressive era when the morality was so clear, right? And essentially, it kind of crossed my mind today. You look at the age of a lot of those people: Steny Hoyer, Nancy Pelosi, a lot of a lot of the people in Congress, and pretty much that was their age. That's the age when they came of age. That's when they developed, and those are where their political instincts are. And despite the fact that history has moved on, they really think that, I mean, they're baby boomers. So they think that their generation's contributions to history and to political culture were the greatest ever. And that's how they want to leave. That's how they want to leave the world. That's how they want to, when they retire, they want to continue. They want to have continued the progressive legacy. And thus, to them, it's 60s mentality. So that's why all conservatives are racists, and that's why during when the healthcare thing started and the Tea Party movement was gearing up, that's why Pelosi, and there were a lot of Democrats who came obviously from the 60s who made references to that era, falsely. Obviously there was violence in that era, but not always was it from the right. Um, that's their frame of reference, and I want to get into the idea of the strategy that conservatives should take in opposition, to some of the things in the newest immigration reform legislation, especially how to take on some of the language that will be used, because you could probably pretty much predict it, given that they're using the NAACP civil rights model of legislative change and political change, and given that they used it a lot during the healthcare debate. But I wanted to get into a couple things about the healthcare debate. It's interesting that the attorney generals of a lot of states are planning litigation to nullify the health care reform bill. I've identified 4 different ways to attack the health care reform bill, all of which I think are not frivolous and have a lot of legs. Obviously, the first one is the Commerce Clause. A lot of people are talking about that. Um, Conservatives for a long time have argued against the expansive reading of the Commerce Clause, essentially because most Americans understood the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. They understood it more narrowly throughout most of the history of the country. But during the Great Depression, given the expansion of the state proposed and pursued by the New Dealers, eventually the Supreme Court caved, and ever since has read this Commerce Clause is very expansive. Now, essentially, the Commerce Clause allows Congress to legislate, regulate any inherent economic activity that, in the aggregate, has some relation to interstate commerce. Okay? They're allowed to regulate how much wheat somebody grows on their farm that they might only be growing for personal consumption. In the most recent case, in 2005, a person was growing medical marijuana, legal at the time in California. He was growing the marijuana for himself. It never left his property. It never left the state. But the Supreme Court ruled the Commerce Clause allows Congress to regulate even that, right? But the question here is, can you force somebody who's economically inactive to become economically active through the Commerce Clause? In other words, I'm not sitting here growing marijuana. I'm not sitting here growing wheat. I'm just sitting here as a guy without health insurance. I don't plan on getting health insurance. I haven't had health insurance for 3 years, right? Does the Commerce Clause expand to that person? That's an interesting question. Obviously, selling health insurance, buying health insurance is an economic activity that could be regulated by Congress. But can they force somebody who doesn't want it, who's not involved in it at all, to buy it? That's a very legitimate constitutional question. The second way of attacking the individual mandates in the health care bill is through the tax and spend power given Congress. Essentially, it's another aspect of how you read the General Welfare Clause. The Congress is given the power generally to tax and spend. I think it's Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, through the General Welfare Clause. And that has been read since the New Deal as very expansive. Although Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, when the Constitution was being written, we should read it narrowly. Jefferson agreed with him ever since Jefferson was elected in 1800, all the way up until the New Deal. The country and the Supreme Court read the General Welfare Clause that facilitates, Congress's tax and spending power is very narrow. And the question will be, I think, very similar. The tax essentially is a penalty, right? It's not really a tax. So since it's not really a tax, does the General Welfare Clause allow you to tell somebody to do something? I mean, telling somebody to buy a product is like telling him to wear his hat wear his hat a certain way or sleep a certain way. Oh, and I'm running out of time. Well, I'm going to have to go to part 2. So I will see you in part 2. I hope this is interesting to you. All right, bye.